Hi listeners, my name's Narinder Singh. I'm the founder and CEO of Look Deep, and I want you to meet Amy.
Thanks, Narinder. I'm an AI assistant that can see. I was created by Look Deep, the first company to bring peer-reviewed computer vision into hospitals.
Amy watches for signs that a patient needs help, supports the care team, and makes sure no one ever feels alone in their care.
I'm sure you have questions. I'd love to answer them. Come talk with me at lookdeep.ai/Amy.
I'm Michael Esquivel.
And I'm Steve Krause. And every Monday, we bring you the latest in healthcare innovation as we sit down with entrepreneurs and industry experts.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back to our 200th episode of the show. I'm your host, Hallie Tecco, and today for this milestone episode, we are joined by Dr. Tom X. Lee, and there's a story behind the X that I'm going to get to. But first, let me introduce him. He is one of the rare serial entrepreneur/doctors who has shaped and been involved in multiple waves of digital health. First, he founded Epocrates, which was a mobile reference app that became a must-have tool for doctors in the early days of the smartphone. It was acquired by Athena Health for $293 million in 2013. Then he founded One Medical, a reimagined model for primary care that ultimately went public before getting acquired by Amazon for $3.9 billion in 2023. And I am a One Medical customer still to this day. And now with Galileo, Tom is working on what may be his most ambitious project yet, a technology-enabled medical group designed to scale high-quality, affordable care. Tom, welcome to the show.
Wow, that was an amazing intro. I would only believe half of that, but it has been a long journey, and thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here on your 200th.
So we have so much to cover today, but where I really would like to start is talking about you being a doctor and an entrepreneur. In prepping for our conversation, I actually found a quote of yours saying that doctors are not really good at management. And I had a good chuckle just because it feels so hypocritical for you as a successful doctor who's been a physician founder to say that. How have you reconciled those two things in your own career?
Yeah, it's still relatively true. It's not necessarily a negative indictment on the medical profession. It's just the way we're trained, the way we're groomed, the mindset of a great clinician isn't necessarily what you want in a manager or an entrepreneur. And so there are characteristics that the academic medical centers in particular foster: research orientation, a risk-averse mindset, do no harm, that doesn't lend itself well towards entrepreneurship, towards what I call ambiguity and delegation of management. So culturally and academically, clinicians are just trained in a very different world. And so the crossover is uncommon and unlikely. And then once you've invested 25, 30 years of your career going through medical training, it's rare that a clinician then says, gosh, I'd really like to do this business thing. And I was mostly an accidental entrepreneur. I didn't want to necessarily do business or entrepreneurship. I was just compelled because as a clinician, I just was not inspired by what we were doing in any ecosystem that I'd seen.
Are there traits in clinicians that you think actually do lend them to being good founders and managers?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think there are personality characteristics that, transcend your training. I think clinicians and entrepreneurs in particular, if we're talking about entrepreneurship, curiosity is a key.
Yeah.
A learning mindset is a key. Those are generally true among most docs. I think what's less common is comfortable with ambiguity, comfortable thinking outside what you're told. I was a pretty good student. So, for quite some time, I just did what I was told, regurgitated what I was supposed to regurgitate, but I never really developed my own insights. And then I started to realize that, all these insights are just regurgitated from other people. And over time, you start to do your own critical thinking. And I think that doesn't lend itself commonly in the medical world, shockingly. And I think it's been, frankly, a lost art in medicine, the ability to do critical empiric thinking without randomized clinical trials. And you see some of this tension in academic medicine today, which is this kind of risk aversion to try things that may be empirically intuitive, but not factually validated in the research. And so there is that kind of comfort with ambiguity and empiricism that I think is lacking a bit. And those characteristics, I think, are better suited in entrepreneurship. And then there is this kind of ability to be humble about your knowledge set. And I think, again, I just grew up in the Ivy Tower. You just assume that you understand how the world works, and then you walk out of it and you're like, oh, geez, it was inverted. And so I think that humility also culturally hasn't been there. And I think, humans or individuals that might have that characteristic might be better suited towards learning and management.
Yeah. I think we're starting to see more clinicians interested in joining startups. A lot of my clinician friends are asking me how they can get involved. I've been following everything that Scrub Capital is doing. It feels like there's a wave of clinicians who are eager to be involved in whatever happens next. But I think we can both agree that healthcare is changing very quickly, and the job of the clinician is going to look very different in 10, 20, 30 years. I'm curious if you have thoughts about medical education, which we know has always been a little slow to adapt and change. How do you think medical education needs to change in order to prepare the current group of medical students and residents for the future that you envision?
Well, for sure. I think having clinicians, especially ones that have practiced, take on leadership roles in management is really critical for us to have a thoughtful, clinically oriented healthcare system. So I do think it's an imperative that clinicians increasingly try to cross-train, or folks that have a broader interest range, expand their wings. And there's no question that the practice is going to be changing much more rapidly than I think most people anticipate over the next several years. So the practice will change, and clinical leadership and leadership will need to change with that. Unfortunately, the educational system in healthcare is pretty, slow to change. That's what healthcare education is generally designed to do. And the unfortunate thing is, the world is changing much more quickly. And so there have been some advancements, but they're fairly incremental compared to the pace of change in society. And so I do think that this is creating a rift between, what I call the institutions of care versus, how people can start to develop their own hypotheses and test them out in the real world. So I think we're seeing some of that tension being played out today. Even just, again, I'm big on integrative elements and understanding lifestyle as medicine. It's just been poorly researched, and empirically it makes a lot of sense. You start to see the data now in Alzheimer's on lifestyle, and for us to be pursuing these pharmaceutical interventions when lifestyle seems to be a much more intuitively plausible solution, not to diminish the importance of genome and other drugs, but it does seem like there is an opportunity here to kind of reimagine healthcare much more broadly and expansively, separate from the economics of it, which are also constrained. If you think about kind of the constraints of innovation here, you have the academic culture and the clinical culture, but then you also have the payment of care all being relatively calcified and rigid. Yeah.
Which do you think is a bigger challenge that we're facing?
Oh, I think the economics is by far the more driving force behind it. I think, clinicians, and organizations would be much more liberated if the economics were better aligned with what we wanted.
Well, so let's double click on that. What would, if you could just rewrite the entire system, wave a magic wand and rewrite the entire system, what does that look like?
The way I think about healthcare is we've conflated into one good. It's either one public good that everybody has the right to, or one private good that we shouldn't have insurance at all. And I do think it's much more mixed. And so when I think about healthcare, there's, 2 or 3 types of goods. One, which seems like a clear public good, is, like clean air, clean water. public health. So public health to me, you don't want to be walking the street and some guy with tuberculosis just can't afford the meds. Those meds should be covered by taxpayer dollar to everybody's benefit. So to me, public health is a clear public good that we just, ideally would cover through taxpayer dollar. And then and then maybe there's a second public good, which is more of a moral public good, which is in a country of wealth, should a person who gets cancer go bankrupt if they have no means to cover a basic treatment. So there's some minimum floor of coverage that needs to be offered to most Americans. And I think that's just a moral choice that we have to make or not in a country of wealth. Everything in between there, in my mind, could be easily considered a private good. And I think we've been too hand-holdy with the consumer on how they should spend their dollar. And in the middle, I think, moving that into the hands of the consumer obviously would liberate a lot and still keep that moral floor and the public health protected. So that's kind of how I think about it, but we can all dream.
Yeah. I mean, one kind of theme in the companies that you've started is kind of removing the middleman and going kind of directly to the user or patient in the product. Like, One Medical was like, you don't want to have to deal with your insurance company. You just do direct pay and you become a member. Maybe you can talk about that and also let us in on Galileo and the big vision that you're chasing there.
Yeah, no, happy to. Yeah, so you can hope that the economics rewrite themselves, but we know there's enough dollars in the system. And so the thesis about both One Medical and Galileo is instead of waiting for policy to be magically rewritten, which I think is unrealistic, just work within the dollars and figure out ways to make the dollars work against what the market would want long term, both as an individual and as a buyer of healthcare. And so we've always, attacked patient experience as the first element of care, right? Just design a model that patients want, and then figure out the economics. And the kind of the hidden thing about both One Medical and Galileo is it's all about cost reengineering. It's taking the same dollars, but doing the work more effectively, using better people, better process, and better tech. And so with One Medical, it was more about the front end, make the front end of care easier, better, cheaper, faster. And so that's what we focus on is the experience into the provider, into the exam room. That was the kind of the goal. And then once you saw the physician or nurse practitioner, the time we invested back was higher because we'd saved all the overhead on the administrative efficiencies that we'd garnered. So that was the thesis around One Medical, and that worked well. With Galileo, we wanted to move that high-touch model to all lives and into the home. And so to do so, you needed a much more radical, clinically re-engineered model. So Galileo is the front end of One Medical plus the back end that's been newly redesigned to say, how should care be delivered across an individual of a range of different types of segments? And how should the population be managed from a public health and proactive stance perspective? So it's a very different care thesis and care model using data and tech and obviously AI to kind of help facilitate a closer to the norm care model than what we were able to accomplish. One Medical was like crawl, walk, run kind of mindset.
Yeah. Give us an example of what that would be on the back end that would be done differently at Galileo versus any other provider, concierge medicine, or direct primary care model.
Yeah, if you ask most clinicians, and this is particularly true of concierge or like a One Medical framework, what % of your time in the exam room is productively utilized, most clinicians say very little. And in traditional practice, a lot of docs would say 10% of my brain is being used during the day. And that's because of administrative waste. At One Medical and other concierge practices, it's less administrative burden, but there's still a lot of waste because of the redundancy of clinical care that's delivered. Like, did this need to be seen in the exam room? Did I have to ask the same 15 questions every single time? Did I really need to do the patient education over and over again? So just, basic clinical care workflow is highly repetitive and time consuming. And then there's a separate issue, which is the fidelity of clinical decision-making is human-based right now. And the vast majority of clinical scenarios, both at the top institutions, both physically and digitally delivered, you're reliant on the clinician's memory training, recent data and limited access to your data or not at the time of decision making. It doesn't matter what the expertise is. You see a generic doctor for most issues, and the reality is the knowledge exists elsewhere. It's just not necessarily in the clinician you're seeing. And so that mismatch of expertise and skills, the processes in which you make those decisions are kind of, winged by most clinicians. 80% might be right, but 20 to 40% could be wrong, depending on which provider you're seeing for what situation. And that's where you see all these, bad stories. You got time constraints with a lot of clinicians, and then you got decision-making constraints by clinicians, and then you have follow-up constraints by a lot of clinicians, and that leads to what most people get in most healthcare systems, which is a fragmented, defect-prone experience.
Uncoordinated.
Yep, totally.
I would say. So what would that look like for me as a patient coming in? Do I have a single person I'm assigned to, or is it I'm assigned to the person that's like the best for that specific concern I have?
Yeah, so we're combining what we call the best of humans with best in tech into this unified experience. And then based on who you are, your situation, we will get you the right type of care in the right format, whether that be physical. Sometimes we'll take care of patients in the home, sometimes in the office. But the vast majority of clinical situations, if you asked, most, experienced practitioners, how often do you need to physically see somebody to make a diagnosis and treat them accurately? It's very unusual. Yeah. And so for us, the care experience is much more integrated into the Galileo ecosystem. So if you've got a relationship-based issue, then you're going to be matched with your primary care team, not necessarily provider specifically, because your provider is not available 24/7 and doesn't have the continuity that would be beneficial in a relationship-based situation. So there's a team that's accountable for you. But if you've got a very specific issue that's either urgent care or very specialized, it'll get routed to that provider with the right expertise. And so all of those processes and the experience need to be redesigned so that it's more seamless, it's consistent, and you don't need to know, you don't have to retell your story to another human. It's all factored into the handoffs between all the different team members that are involved in your care, plus the algorithms and the expertise baked in. The other thing that's kind of hard to see as a patient, but the clinicians see, is how we layer in algorithmic thinking throughout the whole care experience so that you're not having, back when we did Epocrates, we looked at this, which is if you could really abstract the wisdom of the best pharmacists or the best clinicians, it just streamlines decision-making, but you have to really understand the scenarios in which clinicians change their decision-making. So situation A is very different than situation B, so I might give you a different response depending on those situations. And so our systems are sophisticated to understand those and then help provide the right prompts and tools for the providers so they don't have to remember everything, which is just unrealistic given today's medical complexity.
Do you think that we are far off from AI being able to diagnose and prescribe as well as a human doctor?
It depends, right? So you could argue the answer is here today, but it depends on the situation for whom, so if I've got a simple patient, we've got non-complex decision-making on a set of facts that are relatively indisputable.
I've got rosacea. You
don't need a human clinician today, right? So that's all available today. Then there's just the regulatory aspects of who is actually pushing the button, but that'll change. You can imagine that'll change as a function of time over specific situations. Well, when it comes to the healthcare system, if you think about the healthcare system, we're not talking about simple decisions. If you think about healthcare today, there already is, the WebMDs and the Googles and the content and the education. And so LLMs kind of help, make that easier and better. So that's an enhancement. But then you start to move into simple clinical decision-making, and that's where we're in this new gray zone. But I think the deeper aspects of, for you as a patient who has different trade-offs and different complex situations, I think there's going to be some nuance around how the tech can, truly replace the human aspects of it. I think it's certainly plausible, but I think in my mind, it's less about the tech. It's more about the human, meaning the patient. And, even in, Galileo's model, which is a digital first model, you'd be surprised at how many educated people think that they need to see a provider physically to get the best care. And so moving from physical to digital is a stretch for a lot of people. Yeah. Now imagine moving from digital to an AI assist or an AI only model. Yeah. I think there's going to need to just be some comfort. Obviously, for the frontier people, they're already using it. The real question is, when do the masses use it? Yeah. And or is it really going to solve some of the more fundamental issues around behavioral change, quality, cost of care that are much more structural in the ecosystem? So I think they're all going to be part of the solution, and they'll be augmenting. But I think the question is, what types of organizations will help facilitate that change faster?
Yeah. I mean, if you think about how many folks are now getting their scripts without ever talking to a clinician, they're filling out a form on HIMSS. They never see anyone, and they're getting these scripts rather quickly. And how quickly, I mean, a decade ago, that was unheard of. And now we have multiple billion-dollar companies.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, overall, I think it's net positive. I think you just got to harness it in the right way and do it thoughtfully, just like everything else.
Do you ever worry that, like, if we start depending on AI too much, that clinicians will kind of lose their ability to think critically and independently on issues, and then we're like just depending on the machines too much?
Yeah, I do think it depends on what part of your brain is atrophying. I do think that memory recall is a poor use of your brain, but logical architectures that can fit into a shorthand for truth, those muscles need to be developed, if not augmented, because it's increasingly hard to scrutinize what truth is. And so, if you care about truth and ultimately outcomes for patients in this context, you have to have some plausibility or belief kind of framework for understanding how an intervention might work, rather than just solely relying on the content that's put in front of you. I just think that there's just enough instances where you question the AI directly, and they're like, "Oh yeah, sorry, my mistake." I'm like, "Okay, you didn't really present it as a probability when you told me, but then you kind of question the thought process, and then they're like, no, actually, you're right." So there still is a probabilistic aspect to everything here, and I think if you're really trying to drive impact, you're going to need to have some way to validate whatever's closer to truth.
Yeah. I mean, I want my doctor having all the knowledge at their fingertips, right? But I also, I do where I know there was that study that showed that, like, doctors plus AI performed worse than doctors alone. Like, actually the AI brought them down in terms of critical thinking. So it's an interesting time, for sure. Yeah. So, okay, speaking of time, I did notice a pattern in your work history. You had exits in 2013 and 2023. So if the pattern holds, Galileo is lined up for an exit in 2033. But in all seriousness, let's talk about kind of building for exits, because I don't think that enough people, specifically founders, really internalize the fact that when you take outside money, you are building to exit, and you've had every sort of exit. So I'm curious what advice you have for founders that are kind of on this track and considering raising venture funding, and what it means to build a company. I mean, this is very different from building a brick and mortar practice that is a lifestyle business that you have for 50 years. Building a startup that you scale and sell or take public is a very different journey.
Yeah. Yeah, I think everybody just needs to know why they're doing a startup. People always say, I just want to do this thing. I'm like, well, what's your real meta goal here? And I think a lot of entrepreneurs and founders don't think about it as concretely as that. And so I think the more clear you are that it's either long-term impact or economic success, and you have to put them in one, too. There's no both. You got to kind of be as clear-eyed as you can about what your ultimate goal is and be aware of the trade-offs. Then you can kind of start to think through what are the economic ways to fund the journey, right? And you can be much more deliberate about it. For me, I've always been focused on bigger impact. And so to me, it's even before healthcare and VC were really well matched. I was pretty convinced that tech VC and healthcare services was a needed ingredient to get the type of change faster across the ecosystem. And it's still challenging, but it's the capital you can get from VC helps accelerate the learning, helps accelerate the potential. It does put more pressure on the exit and outcome timing, but those are the trade-offs that you make when you're trying to make bigger impact. Some people, that's not what they want. They want either a lifestyle business, so they're okay with a small win and in a more measured way. That's totally fine too. But yeah, but at least, again, I think as long as you're clear-eyed about what it means to raise capital, I think it's the trade-off that you're making. And just to be clear, I'm hoping we don't have to wait till 2033. And my investors probably are saying, what? That's not going to happen. But yes.
So was the exit on your mind early on, every day, or was it just kind of like opportunistic? Like, were you out there like talking to your potential acquirers and getting to know them and thinking about, the multiple that you needed, or did it just kind of like fall on your lap?
Well, it's interesting. I was on a different panel with Brad Smith, who we also hadn't chatted much before, and we had two very different approaches. He's very clear about what he's trying to do up front, and that's great. And there are a lot of entrepreneurs that probably should think like him if they want to have a financial outcome and be quite measured and paced about it. And that's one way to build companies. And if you're good at it, that's a great way to do it. I'm, like I said, I'm probably more the black sheep. I just like making impact, and I'm patient. And, people are like, I should be on a beach. And I'm like, no, this is fun. Until healthcare is solved, it's like, why not leverage my expertise? And so, yes, there's a different way to do it. I don't think this is a common way to do it, but I focus on building impact and great companies whenever possible. Epocrates was kind of a starter company. It was, a few friends from business school. We were just doing it just to cut our teeth. But One Medical was like the first kind of cut at services. Galileo is hopefully the last cut at services, but it's all about making impact. And to me, the service lane in particular has been the most attractive for that reason. And with it, the outcomes financially should follow. But I'm always cognizant of the key stakeholders being our investors, and I want to make sure that they get an exit. Yeah.
You probably knew Jonathan Bush and you knew the folks that were in the world, in the universe of potential acquirers. But what about Amazon? Because that was not the obvious acquirer for One Medical. I think a lot of us were surprised at that acquisition. And I know you left several years before, but what was it? What was that deal? How did that deal kind of come about? And what was it like to kind of watch it unfold as the founder, but you were, outside at that time?
Yeah, I think in both situations, Epocrates, there was a management team, the company went public, and that transaction was facilitated. We knew Jonathan, obviously, we were friendly with Jonathan and Athena team. So that felt like a good cultural fit from early days. And, that was a separate decision-making process by the executive team there. Similar to One Medical in the sense that, we had interacted with Amazon, Apple, all the kind of key tech companies while we were a growing company. Everybody was interested in the healthcare ecosystem. And then we went public, and Amir was leading the company in the public ecosystem. And to me, again, the executive team and the board made that decision. To me, it wasn't that far afield. I'd known the Amazon team quite well, and I felt like it was a good cultural fit. And how we viewed the world from a healthcare ecosystem wasn't that far off. And, again, the specifics on the deal are really for Amir and the board to hash out. But to me, I was supportive of that fit among all acquirers. I think from afar it might seem odd, but, One Medical's DNA was all about, patient experience, affordability. And so those elements were similar using tech. And they'd already done, Whole Foods. So that kind of wasn't that far afield from a brick and mortar and alignment perspective. There's a lot of resonance there. So, but that being said, I don't really build entities to be acquired per se. That's not my ethos. And so I just like to build great entities. And sure, if as it's like your kids. You don't know exactly what's going to happen, but yet I ideally like them to be a self-sufficient adult. But sometimes they get married, and who knows what, right?
That's someone else's problem, right?
Yeah.
And we had John Mackey, the Whole Foods founder, on the show, which was really fun, and he has opinions on Amazon.
I mean,
that are not so positive.
I mean, John's John. He's got more of a pointed view.
Yeah. We also had TJ from PillPack. So we've had all the big Amazon acquisitions on the show, which is exciting. I mean, we need these large companies from both healthcare and tech to be interested in this intersection in this digital health world. It's only good for the ecosystem. So I'm all for it.
Organizations do what they do. You shouldn't be surprised that Amazon does what Amazon does, that Microsoft does what Microsoft does. I'm not expecting it to suddenly become a Whole Foods hippie or a One Medical disciple. Like, we're part of that ecosystem. There will be some transformation, hopefully net positive. And the culture that we built at One Medical is still quite solid from a clinical culture and philosophy perspective. So that still endures, hopefully will endure for time. But that's the key is, how do you keep these cultures in other reinforcers? Because those go beyond just the hard and fast rules, but they do tend to erode with time, which is why I always start with the bias of independence.
Yeah. Do you think you're competitive now? Galileo is competitive with One Medical?
Isn't everything kind of competitive on the far horizon? But I mean, look, I think we're all in healthcare services. We have a more radical tech thesis than most, but I do think it's just a completely different chassis. So, we're, in addition to commercial, we service ACA, Medicare, and Medicaid. We're in the home in addition to virtual and physical. So it's a much more radical platform. So sure, we're in the same space, but it's not like we're running into each other every day.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, Tom, it was great to catch up with you and hear about all you're doing. Thank you so much for your time today.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
You walk in tired and hungry, one bad dinner away from losing it. You don't like to cook. You don't want more takeout. You just want something good. That's why there's Dish by Blue Apron. Pre-made meals with at least 20 grams of protein and no artificial flavors or colors. From fridge to fork in 5 minutes or less. Keep the flavor. Ditch the subscription. Get 20% off your first 2 orders with code APRON20. Terms and conditions apply. Visit blueapron.com/terms for more.